So now I'm going to give the floor to Eddy.
Thanks, Jordan. All right, so this will be my paper. Again, the title of my paper is Creation Order, Molinism, and Role-Playing Games. So while the greater good theodicy is the most common response to the problem of evil, Bruce Little believes that the popular appeal to the greater good theodicy has not only proven to be unconvincing, it has in fact committed the theist to a very questionable position that unnecessarily requires him to prove more than is possible. So Little's dissatisfaction with greater good theodicies led him to consider a creation order theodicy as a more satisfactory response. One component of Little's creation order theodicy is an appeal to Molinism. Little believes that God's middle knowledge is able to resolve the apparent contradiction between God's sovereignty and human free will. Does Molinism provide the sufficient explanatory power to resolve the contradiction between God's sovereignty and free will within Little's creation order theodicy? In this paper, I'm going to argue that Molinism fails to provide the true libertarian freedom with which Little requires for his creation order theodicy. In the place of Molinism's failure, I will explore whether an analogical view of God as a game master or GM in a role-playing game or RPG system could offer a stronger alternative framework for libertarian free will that better fits Little's creation order theodicy. So first, Little's creation order theodicy will be summarized with a focus on his view of libertation, free will, and God's sovereignty. Next, Molinism will be briefly introduced and examined to see whether it can provide the libertarian free will necessary for Little's theodicy. After Molinism has been analyzed, I will present the analogy of God as a GM in an RPG world. This RPG analogy will be analyzed to determine whether this model provides a better representation for divine sovereignty and libertarian free will. So to start, a creation order theodicy. After Little reaches his conclusion that a number of disturbing theological and philosophical concerns surface upon close scrutiny of the greater good theodicy, Little argues that his creation order theodicy can provide a more satisfying alternative theodicy. Little's creation order theodicy centers around the idea that God has created the best of all possible worlds, which allows for the existence of gratuitous evils. When God created the world, he established a certain creation order which comprises the moral and physical parameters through which God is able to be involved dynamically and meaningfully in his creation. While God does not lose any of his divine attributes, God willingly limits himself in the interest of establishing a meaningful person-to-person relationship with man. God set the stage for creation in his interactions with creation through this creation order framework. There are two crucial but seemingly conflicting components to Little's creation order theodicy. The first component is the necessity for man to have true libertarian freedom with which to love God and other people. Little believes that without libertarian freedom available, man will be nothing more than a mindless automation. Little highlights the importance of man's ability to make authentic choices when he states, I believe that the power of choice given to mankind is one aspect of humanness that makes man so unique that to deny the wonder and greatness of this aspect is to generate God's creation. As such, if God creates man with libertarian freedom, then subsequently man can be held responsible for the positive and negative consequences that result from his choices. Thus, this leads Little to conclude that the best possible world must be one in which man has libertarian freedom to make actual choices. The other crucial component for Little's creation order theodicy is God's sovereignty over his creation. Little notes that the greater good theodicies tend to define God's sovereignty as that all individual choices of men are only those which God directly permits. The greater good theodicy definition provides a strong deterministic understanding of God's sovereignty, where everything, including sin and evil, happens because God wills it to happen. Little, on the other hand, defines sovereignty as divine autonomy. He explains, because God is sovereign, he is the supreme ruler, since his pre-creation and creation choices were not influenced by anyone or anything outside himself. In God's sovereignty, humans are granted libertarian free will such that human responsibility is true. Thus, within Little's understanding of God's sovereignty, God's creation order sets the framework where man has libertarian freedom to make true choices, but God remains in control over his creation. However, accepting both God's sovereignty and human libertarian freedom seems prima facie difficult because the acceptance of one would seem to exclude the other. If God is sovereign, then humans could not be truly free to make choices, since their choices would have to be already determined by a sovereign God, and vice versa. In order to solve this apparent dilemma, Little appeals to the concept of middle knowledge introduced in Molinism. Little believes that middle knowledge offers a way to understand how God's sovereignty and the integrity of man's libertarian freedom work together without denying either. While Little believes the appeal to middle knowledge can resolve the apparent conflict between God's sovereignty and human libertarian freedom, he does not think that middle knowledge is necessary. In fact, Little admits if middle knowledge is found to be unsatisfactory, either theologically or philosophically, there would be some slight adjustments made to my proposed creation order theodicy. However, I'm not sure it would defeat the theodicy. Even if the failure of middle knowledge does not defeat God's creation order theodicy, the unanswered conflict between God's sovereignty and human libertarian free will would still remain concerning. If middle knowledge is unable to resolve the sovereignty freedom issue, Little would need to locate a new framework for his creation order theodicy that more successfully resolves the conflict between God's sovereignty and human libertarian freedom. So let's examine middle knowledge. Does middle knowledge provide the framework needed to reconcile God's sovereignty and true human libertarian freedom? This next section will briefly introduce the Molinist concept of God's middle knowledge and examine whether middle knowledge can accomplish the task set before it. Molinism holds that God has three distinct types of knowledge: natural, free, and middle. God's natural knowledge contains all that which is possible, and God's free knowledge is his knowledge of the actual. God's middle knowledge lies between his free and natural knowledge. Wieringa explains middle knowledge was supposed to be the intermediate between those two, because, like the former, natural knowledge, its objects are thought to be independent of God's will, but like the latter, free knowledge, its objects are contingent rather than necessary truths. God's middle knowledge is that knowledge of counterfactuals of moral agents, or as William Hasker would state, middle knowledge extends the doctrine of divine foreknowledge to include the knowledge of the outcome of choices that might have been made, but in fact were not. Thus, with middle knowledge, God's omniscience includes all actual decisions made by moral agents, as well as hypotheticals that would have been actual given different circumstances. Little believes that God's middle knowledge is beneficial for his creation order theodicy for several reasons. First, prior to creation, God utilizes his middle knowledge to actualize the best possible world from the choices available. Since God knows all the counterfactuals that moral agents can make, God can choose the world that he deems the best. So Little explains the perspective here is that God's middle knowledge is what makes it possible for him to see conceptually all the free choices of his moral creatures in various possible circumstances, and then actualize the best of those possible worlds. With middle knowledge, God has epistemic access to the entirety of possibilities available for creation. Second, God's middle knowledge looks to provide a potential solution to the apparent conflict between God's sovereignty and human libertarian free will. Accepting either extreme position seems untenable for the theists. If God's sovereignty is emphasized, then this comes at the cost of removing human libertarian free will, because God has created a thoroughly deterministic world with no risk. On the opposing side, it seems extremely plausible that in a world involving libertarian free choice, some risks are inevitable, and thus God could no longer be considered sovereign. Middle knowledge allows God to avoid the conflict of two opposing positions. Thomas Flint provides an explanation of how Molinism provides this reconciliation. Because he has middle knowledge and makes free choices concerning which creatures will exist in which circumstances, God has complete foreknowledge concerning how these creatures will act and great control over their actions. Yet, because the knowledge which generates this foresight and sovereignty is not a product of divine free activity, our actions remain genuinely free, not the robotic effects of divine causal determination. So, in this sense, God does not lose any of his divine sovereignty, which is crucial to his divine nature, and humans are still considered truly free to make choices according to libertarian freedom. However, Molinism and middle knowledge in particular is not without its issues and objections. Central issue of this paper is whether Molinism allows for true libertarian freedom. Little's creation order theodicy is dependent on humans having libertarian freedom in a way that is authentic. Without authentic libertarian freedom, Little argues that man would be unable to fulfill his two most important purposes in life: loving God and loving his fellow neighbor. Little highlights this importance when he states, the only way to make love an authentic possibility for man would be to give man the power of choice. Authentic love is the highest function of mankind. Without the ability to make authentic choices, Little's creation order theodicy would begin to fall apart, since the responsibility for evil would fall upon God rather than man. Thus, true libertarian freedom is an essential component of the creation order theodicy, and Little's appeal to Molinism must provide a framework for how libertarian freedom can be preserved alongside God's sovereignty. So, can Molinism and middle knowledge truly provide a framework in which humans have libertarian free will? Upon closer inspection, this claim of authentic libertarian free will does not appear to be as clear as Molinists may want it to be. Instead, Molinist middle knowledge may put more emphasis on God's actualization and thus maybe more deterministic of a framework for the relationship between God and humans than Little's theodicy requires. In Molinism, God in his middle knowledge knew of all the possible counterfactuals that his creatures could make prior to his choosing which possible worlds to actualize. In this sense, God surveys all the numerous creation possibilities available to him before he creates any actual world. God is able to view all the possibilities and select the world that would be considered the best of all possible worlds. Wieringa highlights how Leibniz pictures God prior to creation as surveying countless possible worlds as alternatives to the actual. This would mean that when God actualizes a possible world, he's actualizing the entirety of that world. In other words, from beginning to end. Since God has middle knowledge of all counterfactuals, he would know what would happen if a different choice was made. However, that different choice would then constitute a distinctly different possible world, since the state of affairs of the possible world have now changed. So, Anthony Kenny summarizes the Molinist conception of how God creates. He says, God selects a particular possible and decides to actualize it. Or if you prefer, he takes a particular coherent world history and decides to enact it. God's free decision to select the world prior to its creation would seem to present a deterministic framework rather than one which would allow for human libertarian freedom. If God has already examined all the possible counterfactuals and then chosen to summarize the world based on that examination, then the states of affairs for that world are chosen by God and could not be different because the world is now set in motion. As such, creatures in the actual world are not truly free, at least in Little's libertarian freedom sense, since their decisions are already pre-selected by God. Little also appears to recognize this issue with middle knowledge. He says, from all possible worlds, God selects the best of all possible worlds to be the world that he will actualize. Once the world is actualized, things will be as they are in that world, and they cannot be otherwise. Hasker also reaches this conclusion from middle knowledge, stating, a world in which God's creative and providential action is guided by middle knowledge is a world in which nothing can ever turn out in the slightest respect differently than God intended. Thus, this conclusion does not appear to result in human libertarian free will. Man is unable to do other than what he must in the world God has actualized. The conclusion of Molinism being more deterministic than anticipated may be difficult to visualize, since Molinism was supposed to be a way to retain both God's sovereignty and human libertarian freedom. So one possible way to illustrate the determinism in Molinism is an appeal to analogy. Analogies are never a perfect representation, but analogies can be used as an instrument for reflection and also in the sense of considering the ramifications of that metaphor. So Molinism will be examined through the analogy of what's commonly called the God as author to illustrate the deterministic nature of the Molinist framework. The God as author analogy understands God's relation to his creation in a similar fashion to that of an author in their text. God is understood as an author who originates or creates a work by speaking or writing. Additionally, Kevin Van Hooser claims that human beings nevertheless exercise a secondary authorship and hence genuine freedom. But the degree of creaturely freedom posited can vary based on one's understanding of authorship. One can see God's authorship in a Tolstoy-like manner. A Tolstoy authorship would see God as a monarch author who attains absolute control over the text of the world. God's control as the author is full and extends even to the characters, the human beings. Human beings do not make choices or express independent thought, since God is the only agent who acts and speaks on behalf of humans. Thus, this Tolstoy authorship would be clearly rejected by the Molinists as much too deterministic. However, on the other hand, the Dostoevsky authorship model may provide the analogy that best represents Molinism and middle knowledge. Unlike the Tolstoy authorship, where characters have no voice of their own, Dostoevsky's characters have a voice and can interact with the author of their own volition. Van Hooser explains, polyphonic authorship involves the author making space for and listening to voices other than his own. In this manner, human beings, as characters in the story, can freely respond with their own voice to the author. Thus, while God still remains in his role as divine author, Dostoevsky would understand that the characters of the story can make choices of their own free volition, which keeps their libertarian freedom. The Dostoevsky authorship model provides an analogy with which one can better visualize the shortcomings of Molinism. Even though this type of authorship, the Dostoevsky authorship, may claim to retain human libertarian freedom, humans still lack the agency to do otherwise. The author, or God, is the ultimate causal agent who creates as he pens his text. The character can only passively wait for the author to write or actualize the next part of the story. Thus, even if viewed through the Dostoevsky authorship model, Molinism proves too deterministic to retain human libertarian freedom for Little's creation order theodicy. The God as GM analogy. In light of the deterministic nature of Molinism and middle knowledge, is here another framework that could better assist Little's creation order theodicy in keeping both God's sovereignty and human libertarian freedom? Just as the God as author analogy can provide a helpful illustration for the failings of Molinism, perhaps the role-playing game or RPG system can provide the analogy for a framework needed to resolve the sovereignty-freedom conflict and provide humans with real libertarian freedom. There are many different RPG systems with varying world structures, rules, and story elements. Rather than examine all the various RPG systems, I'm only going to focus on the classic structure of an RPG system involving the game master or the GM, or otherwise known as the DM, and the players. In a classic RPG system, God would occupy the sole role as the GM. As a GM, God would have a number of inherent necessary attributes as part of that unique role. First, a GM is the creator of the world the players inhabit. The Dungeon Master's Guide explains that the Dungeon Master, the DM or GM, is the creative force behind a D&D game. The DM creates a world for other players to explore and also runs and creates adventures that drive the story. The GM establishes the overall game setting and natural laws of the world. While this world would be a fictitious world in a fantasy RPG setting, the idea of a GM as a creator mirrors God's role as creator of all creation. Second, a GM has a type of knowledge that I'm going to call game omniscience. With game omniscience, the GM knows all the rules surrounding the game system they're playing, information about the players, details about current events and other events occurring that players may be unaware of, and of other entities that could be introduced into the game. However, a GM's game omniscience may not include player choices, since a player could always choose differently than what the GM expects. However, a good GM, one who knows his players intimately, should be able to use his knowledge of the players and the world around them to predict what their likely actions would be. Third, a GM is omnipotent and sovereign as it relates to the game world and even to the players themselves. The GM has total causal power to create any entity, actualize any event, or make any necessary modifications he sees fit. The Dungeon Master's Guide provides a helpful explanation of the GM's omnipotence and sovereignty, stating, the D&D rules help you and other players have a good time, but the rules aren't in charge. You're the DM. You're in charge of the game. The world is yours to change as you see fit and yours to modify as you explore the consequences of the player's actions. So thus, the GM can do all he needs or desires within the game. In addition to the attributes the GM has, by virtue of their unique role, the GM also has the freedom to choose the type of game that will be played. The game type refers to the flow of the game, the story that the GM plans to implement. Briefly stated, the GM can run a fully deterministic game where the GM doesn't deviate from the story script and ensures that all events will occur according to the story timeline. On the other end of the spectrum, the GM could run a sandbox game where the GM does not follow a set of narrative, but responds according to what players have freely chosen to do. Finally, the GM can run what's called a narrative-focused game, where the GM has a narrative story planned from beginning to end. As a narrative, the GM would have various crucial events to the narrative, but the players are free to make real choices that have corresponding consequences. The narrative type of game will be the accepted type for understanding God's relationship to creation. In the God as GM analogy, human beings would occupy the role of players in the RPG system. Like a GM, there are certain attributes that a player has in the RPG system. Two attributes will be briefly highlighted: the player's limitation in the world and the player's agency. First, players are necessarily bound by the world they will inhabit and by the limitations of their characters. Players are situated in a specific location and world with its natural laws set by the GM. The players are unable to change many aspects of their spatial or temporal settings. Not only are players limited by the world the GM creates, players are also limited by the capabilities of their players. Each player's character is unique in their attributes and capabilities as described in the player's handbook. Every character brings particular capabilities to the adventure in form of ability scores and skills, class features, racial traits, equipment, and magic items. Every character is different with various strengths and weaknesses. So the best party of adventurers is one in which the characters complement each other and cover the weaknesses of their companions. Players can only perform actions that are within the limits of their characters. So, for example, a character could not fly if he does not possess that ability already or move faster than what their character allows. And they can only perform certain actions up to a particular proficiency. Thus, the players have limitations which constrain the choices available to them. Second, while the players may be limited by the world and by their own characters, players still have agency to make choices. Player freedom is a crucial aspect of the RPG system. For the GM and players to have a successful, the players and GM need to have a necessary relationship in the game. In order for the GM and players to play a successful game, quote unquote, the GM cannot deprive the players of their ability to make true decisions. Wasco and Lust highlight the freedom afforded to players when they state, fantasy personas may say and do whatever they please, so long as other players and the game master agree that actions are reasonable. The choices made by players are their own, and not because the GM has determined them. While the GM may certainly influence player decision-making, the decision-making originates from the players themselves. Finally, the RPG system expects an active relationship between the GM and the players. The GM cannot create a world for the players and then leave the players on their own, since the GM helps the other players visualize what's happening around them. Without the GM present, the RPG game system could not continue, as the GM is responsible for the sustained existence of the world and for any interactions the players have with that world. A continued RPG game requires an active relationship between the GM and the players, where the GM intimately knows the players to help create and run adventures that they will enjoy and remember. So thus, an active relationship between GM and players is a crucial component of a RPG system. Otherwise, the experience comes across in a deistic fashion. So, an analysis of the God as GM analogy. Analogies are not a perfect representation, but they can be a helpful tool to examine philosophical concepts and systems. The God as GM analogy is not perfect, but I think it provides a useful structure to explore whether God's sovereignty can be compatible with human libertarian freedom. While this paper only briefly introduced the God as GM analogy, analysis will be offered to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of this analogy. There are at least two major strengths with appealing to the God as GM analogy. So first, the God as GM analogy seems to provide a viable alternative to Molinism, since God's sovereignty and authentic libertarian freedom can both be preserved. Little's appeal to Molinism appears too deterministic, since God's actualization of the world involves the complete state of affairs for that world. In comparison to Molinism, the God as GM analogy offers a less deterministic framework where humans can truly make choices within creation while God still remains sovereign. The God as GM analogy also fits Little's creation order theodicy, as the analogy posits a world created by God that the players are bound to. This would agree with Little's understanding that man's libertarian freedom is not absolute. It has boundaries established by creation order, which is one way that God controls the direction of history. God's sovereignty is retained since God directs creation in a specific direction while humans make free choices within the bounds of creation. Second, this analogy is a marked improvement over other game-related analogies, such as God as a chess master analogy. The chess master analogy views God as a chess player who knows all possible future developments and can do exhaustive contingency planning from the outset. As a chess master, God would know all possible moves that could be made, while the other players still have the freedom to make their respective moves. However, the chess analogy fails for a number of reasons, but none more prevalent than the fact that chess is a zero-sum game, where, in other words, one player wins is always at the expense of another player. However, this zero-sum game doesn't accurately just illustrate God's relationship to humanity, since God is not trying to win, but instead helps humanity through cooperation. In contrast, the God as GM analogy does not see the GM pitted against the players in competition, but rather the GM works alongside the players to build an engaging world. The Player's Handbook describes this difference in mentality when it states, "There's no winning and losing in Dungeons and Dragons game, at least not in the way those terms are usually understood. Together, the DM and the players create an exciting story of bold adventurers who confront deadly perils." Therefore, the God as GM analogy offers a better illustration compared to other analogies. Now, while the God as GM analogy provides an alternative to Molinism, this analogy is not without its weaknesses. One of the more significant weaknesses is that the God as GM analogy would seem to lead to some version of open theism. Since God does not know the decisions made by human beings before they actually make the decisions, just as a GM would not know absolutely what players do until they make their decisions, it would seem that God could not be considered fully sovereign over creation because God's omniscience is limited. Haster poses the question, if God does not know what the future will be like, how can he tell us what it will be like? On the God as GM analogy, God could be considered a risk taker since he would not know what humans would choose until they make the choice themselves. Now, are there ways for the God as GM analogy to respond to the charge of open theism, or does the analogy just need to bite the bullet and accept open theism? One possible response from the proponent of a God as a GM analogy would be to just accept a limited version of God's sovereignty, where God has freely chosen to limit himself. Little understands that God could retain limited sovereignty in at least two ways. First, God limits human choices as a part of creation order. In other words, there are a limited number of choices for humans to make by virtue of the world they inhabit and by their individual persona. By limiting human choices, Little claims that the direction of human history is shaped in some fashion by God. Second, Little claims that there are certain events God predetermined to happen. God has established the creation order in such a way that human history passes through predetermined events, moving toward a determined end. There are some events determined by God, and as such, they form what he calls the outer boundaries to the possibilities and therefore the direction of human history. This understanding of God's sovereignty is similar to the RPG game type, where God has knowledge of the overarching narrative from start to finish, but not the details along the way. In this sense, God is still sovereign as he maintains what Hasker describes as complete, detailed, and utterly intimate knowledge of the entirety of the past and the present, and the future trajectory of creation. However, God would not have comprehensive foreknowledge, as we traditionally understand as theists. So, would this response of a limited sovereignty be enough to keep the God as GM analogy as a viable option for Little? It's difficult to say. On this definition of limited sovereignty, it would still appear that God's omniscience is deficient since he doesn't have exhaustive knowledge of past, present, and future. Upon reflection of a God who may not be traditionally omniscient, Hasker asks, if God is like this, is he not worthy of our most entire devotion? And if we hesitate to agree to this, is the hesitation because a God so described will be truly unworthy or because of our attachment to a theory? Even if God does not have exhaustive foreknowledge of past, present, and future, perhaps God could still be considered sovereign. Ultimately, the charge of open theism toward the God as GM analogy is significant and would require a far more comprehensive and detailed examination. Conclusion. God's creation order theodicy may provide a more satisfying response to the evidential problem of evil, but his appeal to Molinism to resolve the conflict between God's sovereignty and human freedom may prove too deterministic for the libertarian freedom that Little desires. Little freely admits if middle knowledge is found to be unsatisfactory, either theologically or philosophically, there would need to be some slight adjustments made to my proposed creation order theodicy. If Molinism fails to provide the human libertarian freedom that Little needs, well, perhaps the God as GM analogy in a classic RPG system could offer the framework that retains God's sovereignty while allowing for the libertarian freedom that God desires. While the God as GM analogy has its advantages, the potential of leading to open theism may cause concern for the theists. Certainly, more work beyond the scope of this paper will need to be done to determine whether the God as GM analogy can be a viable framework for the theists. Thank you.